Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's get week 47 of today's Tolkien Times underway with Mailbag Monday. Now, in today's mailbag, we have a question from Alexander. It's a bit complex, and really it's actually two questions. And frankly, I may not be able to answer either to everybody's satisfaction, but it's worth the effort. Alexander says that he's recently become really interested in the genealogical table of Durin's folk in Appendix A, specifically in the inclusion of Durin VII, the last, and that this has raised two questions for him. First, he asks, how do the dwarves know that Durin VII will be the last? And second, what's with the fact that there is no date of birth or death given in the genealogical table? Now, Alexander did some research into peoples of Middle-earth, which I will be doing as well, but he thought that even with that extra information, quote, it seemed like a question that might be interesting to interrogate further. So interrogate we shall. And let's start with a little bit from Appendix A, Section 3, Durin's folk. Durin is the name that the dwarves use for the eldest of the seven fathers of their race, and the ancestor of all the kings of the Longbeards. He slept alone, until in the deeps of time and the awakening of that people, he came to Azanulbazar. And in the caves above Kheled Zaram in the east of the Misty Mountains, he made his dwelling, where afterwards were the mines of Moria, renowned in song. There he lived so long that he was known far and wide as Durin the Deathless. Yet in the end he died before the elder days had passed, and his tomb was in Khazad-dûm. But his line never failed, and 5 times an heir was born in his house so like to his forefather that he received the name of Durin. He was indeed held by the dwarves to be the deathless that returned, for they have many strange tales and beliefs concerning themselves and their fate in the world. So he lived so long that he became known as Durin the Deathless. But just how long did he live? Well, the published texts don't give us a specific time as to the awakening of the dwarves. We know that it was after the elves awoke, because Ilúvatar, but precisely when we're just not sure. But in the War of the Jewels, in one of the bits of text associated with this chapter, Christopher Tolkien shares one of his father's notes. But it is not known when Durin or his brethren first awoke, though some think it was at the time of the departure of the Eldar overseas. Now, if that's the case, then we're looking at sometime during the Years of the Trees between 1132, when the Vanyar and Noldor headed west, and 1150, when the Teleri finally headed over. However, in the section called Last Writings in the Peoples of Middle-earth, we read that he awoke far back in the First Age, it is supposed soon after the awakening of men. Okay, that puts it in a very different time frame. So we're not sure when he was born. We do know that Durin died before the Elder Days had passed. That's also not specific. But assuming that he died near the end of the Elder Days, he might have been as much as 2,400 years old when he died. Truth is, we just don't know. Now, let's go back to that line, the strange tales. So as to those strange tales that the appendix mentioned, we're going to go to the Silmarillion for a snippet from the chapter of Aule and Yavanna about the creation of the dwarves. Aforetime it was held among the elves in Middle-earth that dying the dwarves returned to the earth and the stone of which they were made. Yet that is not their own belief. And that's when we get the bit about being in separate dwarven halls in Mandos, waiting to work with Aule to remake Arda at the end. But now back to the text. They say also that the 7 fathers of the dwarves returned to live again in their own kin and to bear once more their ancient names, of whom Durin was the most renowned in after ages, father of that kindred most friendly to the elves, whose mansions were at Khazad-dûm. So this belief that the spirits of the 7 fathers would be essentially reincarnated was something held by all 7 dwarven houses. But, as Last Writings tells us, it was notably the case in the race of the Longbeards, whose ultimate forefather was called Durin. After we read about the fact that there were several Durins during the Second Age, we then read this. It was prophesied by the dwarves when Dain Ironfoot took the kingship in Third Age 2941 after the Battle of 5 Armies, that in his direct line there would one day appear a Durin the 7th, but he would be the last. We also read that all the Durins retained memory of their former lives as kings, as real, and yet naturally as incomplete, as if they had been consecutive years of life in one person. How in the world does this work? I mean, Tolkien writes that the elves did not know, nor would the dwarves tell them much more of the matter. And then he gives us this extra bit. The dwarves add that at that time, Aule gained them also this privilege that distinguished them from elves and men, that the spirit of each of the fathers should, at the end of the long span of life allotted to dwarves, fall asleep, but then lie in a tomb of his own body at rest, and there its weariness and any hurts that had befallen it should be amended. Then after long years he should arise and take up his kingship again. Now that is interesting. Tolkien included some footnotes to this that might help us think through this. First, that the bodies of dwarves were far slower to decay or become corrupted than bodies of men. Elves, on the other hand, we're told, quickly disintegrated and vanished when their Fëanor, their spirits, left their bodies. Interestingly, as for how a later Durin would fit into the succession, Tolkien surmises that probably this return would only occur when by some chance or other the reigning king had no son. The dwarves were very unprolific, and this no doubt happened fairly often. Interesting. Now, we do get one more useful tidbit in the peoples of Middle-earth, quite likely what Alexander researched before sending me that question. In the section on the making of Appendix A, we read a draft version of a passage. And the line of Dain prospered, and the wealth and renown of the kingship was renewed, until there arose again for the last time an heir of that house that bore the name of Durin. And he returned to Moria, and there was light again in deep places, and the ringing of hammers and the harping of harps, until the world grew old, and the dwarves failed, and the days of Durin's race were ended. Wow. That would explain why Durin the Seventh would be Durin the Last. He would be the king until the dwarves failed, and their race ended altogether. Now, Christopher Tolkien adds that this was where the idea of Durin the Last emerged. And it is said of him that he returned from Erebor to Moria and reestablished it, as it is said in the accompanying genealogical table. But then we get a partial answer to Alexander's question. Speaking of the return of Durin to Moria, Christopher says, "To this my father never referred again. It is impossible to discover whether my father did in fact reject this idea, or whether it simply became lost in the haste with which the appendices were finally prepared for publication. The fact that he made no reference to Durin the Seventh and Last, though he appears in the genealogy in Appendix A, is possibly a pointer to the latter supposition." So, to answer the questions, how do the dwarves know he'll be the last? I suppose we can say they don't really know, but that their prophecies say that he will not only be the last Durin, but he'll be the last king of Durin's folk, the last king of the dwarves. And why no date of birth or death in the genealogical table? That's easier. In universe, the reason is pretty straightforward. He hadn't been born yet. If you look at the table, you'll see this title or description of the genealogy itself. The line of the dwarves of Erebor as it was set out by Gimli, Glóin's son, for King Elessar. Aragorn, the king Elessar, died on March 1st, 4th age 120, so Durin the Seventh simply hadn't arrived by that point. He was prophesied to come, so he's on the chart with the dashed line from Thorn the Third Stonehelm, who was still alive. Durin the Seventh would be his descendant, and in fact, in one draft, it was actually his son. And there is all you ever wanted to know about Durin. Folks, that wraps it up for Mailbag Monday. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please email it to barliman@theprancingponypodcast.com. Let them know it's for today's Tolkien Times, and I will get to it as soon as possible, with priority going to supporters of the show on Patreon. Now, if you'd like to help me keep making this show better, please visit patreon.com/Tolkien Times to find out how you can join the TTT Content Council, get a bonus episode each week, and a whole lot more. And please join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Tolkien Tuesday, as we learn more about the professor himself. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe, follow or subscribe in your podcast apps, and follow @Tolkien Times on social media. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.